Welcome to Education Insight. I'm Lacey Kendall. There's a nonprofit news organization based here in California that focuses on education and education data reporting here in our state. Week before last, EdSource published a commentary from 3 research professors at USC, Patricia Birch, Morgan Polikoff, and Dr. Jon Fullerton, who is also the executive director of the USC EdPolicy Hub. The article offered stern advice on how California might find real solutions for our state's education system if we intend to move past the pains caused by the pandemic and our country's culture wars.
Part of our responsibility as citizens is to be able to work with and argue with people we argue with, but also sort of work with and have a conversation with people we disagree with on fundamental things even.
More on that coming up shortly on Education Insight. But first, a look at what folks are talking about in education this week. An LA lawmaker is working to limit immigration officers' access to schools and daycare centers. Assemblymember Al Muratsuchi introduced the bill to create what he calls safe spaces for immigrant children. According to KQED San Francisco, the new proposal mandates that officers show a valid ID, a statement of purpose, and a court order. They also need approval from the school superintendent or daycare director before entering. Even with the required documents, officers could not enter when children are present. Current laws already forbid schools from collecting students' immigration status information. Schools can also deny campus access during school hours to ensure safety. Muratsuchi told KQED, quote, "Children shouldn't fear school and parents shouldn't fear sending them," end quote. The proposed law aims to protect children during the upcoming presidential administration. A new report shows that California's higher education workforce is more racially diverse than it was a decade ago. The State Legislative Analyst's Office found increases in Latino and Asian employees from 2013 to 2023. At the same time, the share of white workers declined across all sectors. Community colleges saw a slight raise in black workers, but their numbers dropped at UC and CSU campuses. Among tenured and tenure-track faculty, diversity also improved, with community colleges having the most diverse group. The experts say recent hiring trends is what helped drive that change. At the CSU, white faculty hires fell from over half in 2012 to about a third in 2022. Community colleges also saw gains, but faculty diversity still lags behind their diverse student body. As mentioned at the top of our show today, we're joined by Dr. Jon Fullerton of USC's EdPolicy Hub, one of the authors of an article that has really caught the attention of educators, insisting that the path is narrow on how California can solve issues like serious absentee numbers and the culture wars we've experienced around schools. Welcome to Education Insight, Dr. Fullerton.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
First of all, could you tell us a little bit about your research and the work you do at the EdPolicy Hub and what led you to this article that so many people are talking about this week?
Absolutely. So the EdPolicy Hub is a new center at USC Rossier School of Education. It was founded about a year ago. And our mission is to work with education agencies in Southern California to answer questions and provide evidence about issues that they are working on, are struggling with, or challenged by. And we really have our focus is more on questions coming from the field and less on pushing abstract academic arguments, if you will. So, as part of that, coming out of the election, I think there's questions about what now? So it was an incredibly contentious election, and there's lots of talk about what may or may not happen at the national level. And I think we at the Hubs, that's me, my co-authors Patricia Birch and Morgan Polikoff, really thought that sort of like the issue is education is mainly a state and locally run operation. And so if we want to make things better for kids in California, we have to think about what we can do here and now to improve outcomes and improve governance.
The article outlines several pressing challenges that are facing California's education system. Some of the things you mentioned: lagging student achievement and chronic absenteeism. Which of those issues, Jon, do you feel demands the most immediate attention, and why?
So I think in terms of the things that we listed, chronic absenteeism is probably the most immediate issue. And I think the reason for that is fairly straightforward. If students aren't in school, they're not learning. And in sort of prior research I've worked on, we've seen that basically that there's a linear relationship between student growth outcomes and the amount of time that they're in school. So that is really critical. And as you probably know, in California and across the nation, chronic absenteeism, which is defined as missing 10% or more of a school year, has jumped dramatically with the pandemic. So in California, it went from 10% to 30% in 21-22 and dropped to 25%-ish last year, or rather in 22-23, and then 23-24 it's dropped again, but it's still at 18% for K-8 and at 20% overall. So that's over 1 million kids are chronically absent in California. So that is really, I think, the top thing. And so instructional improvement won't matter if kids aren't there.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned was Mississippi's success with their science of reading reforms. I was wondering if you would briefly explain that for our listeners and maybe how it might be adapted to fit California's own unique educational landscape.
Sure. So Mississippi, about 10 years ago, sort of began adopting and focusing really heavily on curriculum and sort of new approaches to instruction. And this is actually not a new approach to instruction, but they adopted something called the science of reading, which is sort of an approach to learning reading. So for the early grades, that is focused on sort of first on phonics and learning how to sort of decode words, and then second on sort of providing kind of rich content. And what Mississippi did was they adopted sort of and allowed districts to sort of use a sort of pretty limited number of textbooks. And then they provided quite extensive professional development and professional learning to teachers across the state, and really kind of provided incentives for districts to sort of teach or to help teachers learn and sort of implement these new curricula. And they went from basically the bottom in terms of reading achievement, from 49th in the country to about midway, I think 22nd in the country in a quite short period of time on fourth grade reading. So they've really pushed up quickly. And I think what's interesting about Mississippi and a couple other states, Louisiana, I think, is another one that sort of is doing this, is really sort of a laser focus, not just on sort of on providing high quality curriculum materials to districts or providing them the opportunity to have them, but then B, really focusing on teacher professional development and sort of teaching teachers how to use them. Because if you just drop a curriculum on people, they won't necessarily use it, or they won't know how to use it. And so this is a sort of a coherent and sort of longer term focus on improving and changing how reading was taught.
Does your research show that anybody in California is at least attempting that here in our state?
Yeah. Specifically, sort of any district that wants to do this can, and many districts do use science of reading curricula, but some are not. And there's a lot of debate about that in the state. In fact, there was a bill introduced last winter to make science of reading required, essentially, for textbooks required in the state, which was pulled fairly early in its in its legislative journey. And so there'll have to be some tweaks in California for something like this to make sense. I think one learning California could take from a place like Louisiana is that they really focused on not just requiring districts to do things, but sort of they had much more in the way of incentives for districts to adopt and to focus on this type of approach.
Yeah. If you just joined us, you're listening to Education Insight. Dr. Fullerton, career readiness and workforce preparation were highlighted heavily as key student outcomes in your article. And I'm wondering if you could discuss the role that public-private partnerships play in creating career pathways and how those partnerships could be scaled all the way across California.
So if you think about connecting students back to school, connecting and sort of provide, and also connecting students to opportunities that lead them to long-term good jobs, if you will, we need to sort of early on in high school, at least, if not slightly before, sort of begin connecting students to the workforce and what opportunities are there. And if you think about that for very long at all, it's clear that that schools alone cannot do that because you need the workforce side of that, right? So it's really important to sort of have schools, colleges, community colleges, and 4 years, and the business community on the same page and thinking through sort of together sort of how to best do this. And I think there's a number of good examples of that. I think Unite LA has a number of pathways that really connect students to sort of either tech or health or other types of careers. And then sort of shows, sort of provides them the structure and a roadmap to sort of how to get a good job in those areas. Now, in terms of how do you scale that? So California's, I feel like California is not doing a bad job in this particularly because there's something called the Golden State Pathways, which is a state grant that has sort of really helped fund a lot of these kind of collaboratives across districts, states, and then businesses in order to create pathways into successful jobs. Uh-huh. So in that way, that's sort of a nice way to scale it. But sort of by its nature, obviously, sort of really each region has to sort of think about this and deal with it on sort of according to what the business community and the challenges are there.
Don't wait for the state grant to come. Start building in your hometown is what you're saying.
Start building in your hometown, and then the state grant will help you.
Yeah. So. All right. Access to mental health and physical health services. Your research has focused on a lot of that as it pertains to education in California. So what policies or investments do you believe are critical to improve those supports where we need it and as we need it for California's most needy students?
Yes. So I think, and just to highlight why it's so important, is with the pandemic, we saw a real hit on students' sort of mental health or sort of mental healthiness. And historically, California's had very low sort of health services and mental health supports at schools. And sort of through the pandemic, with the additional money that came in from the federal government, some of that went towards mental health services. But sort of now, with that money ending, which is ending this fall, so right now, they will have to sort of some of those services are threatened to go away, and they're going to actually have to backfill. And I think the issue is that if we don't pay attention to this this other issue we talked about around chronic absenteeism is going to sort of continue to be a problem because as kids feel more disconnected from school, they're going to be less likely to want to come to school. So this support is really critical to students. Now, in California, there's the California Community Schools Partnership Program, which sort of ideally districts and schools will sort of work with not just sort of providing their own mental health services or their own services, but also sort of partner with other organizations, nonprofits, and health organizations in the community to provide services. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and that's what this Community Schools Partnership Program is really intended to do, is to sort of help districts begin to unlock that possibility.
Coming up, we'll have more of our conversation with Dr. Jon Fullerton of the Education Policy Hub on the campus of the University of Southern California. This is Education Insight. Welcome back to Education Insight. Our guest is Professor Jon Fullerton, one of the authors of a somewhat popular EdSource commentary on how California can and must work to overcome the education struggles left behind due to the pandemic and our own culture wars. Dr. Fullerton, you touched on this at the top of our interview, and I gotta say, I think it's the most compelling part of your article, and no doubt of your work. Your article mentions our need to de-escalate divisive culture wars in education. My question is, how can school leaders and policymakers create more productive and respectful conversations to focus on our shared goals? What does that look like, and how does it begin?
I think there's a couple of points here. So one is, before I get into the school leaders and policymakers, I think part of this is it's on us, sort of democratic citizens, not in terms of party, but in terms of the sort of living in democracy, to help de-escalate ourselves, right? So it's like part of what democracies are, is there's going to be strong questions, and some of them are going to be normative disagreements, or basically sort of disagreements that aren't going to be solvable by facts, but are about sort of kind of core belief systems and who we are. And I think part of our responsibility as citizens is to be able to work with and argue with people we argue with, but also sort of work with and have a conversation with people we disagree with on fundamental things even. So that's kind of one thing, is that there's a lot of it's on us as the citizens. I think in terms of, if we move towards sort of what can school leaders and policymakers do to foster more productive dialogue. So I think part of what happens is, in public meetings at least, is that sort of the rules are not well explained, and public comment sessions are sort of, I would say, not underutilized, but sort of not utilized to be most effective. And so what do I mean by that? Well, it's like basically when you give a public comment, you have 3 minutes to speak. Typically you speak for 3 minutes or a little less or a little more, and then that's it. There's no real response. There's no real debate. So it's sort of more of speaking almost into the void. And that's partly driven by public access laws and sort of the Brown Act, where sort of there's at least a lot of sort of school board members have hesitation to sort of like directly engage, because then that could be seen as talking about something that was not posted sort of officially and so forth. So basically it's like that's not a great way of necessarily either finding parent opinion or our community opinion and dealing with it. It certainly allows it to get out there, but sort of it doesn't help. And so there's probably more about sort of both explaining kind of what are the rules around this to those who are presenting before every meeting, but then also finding other ways to sort of get parent opinions and parent thoughts on even controversial subjects. So either potentially parent surveys or other other approaches to sort of allow more dialogue to take place. So that's sort of one thought. That's not going to solve the problem, but it is one potential move.
If you just joined us, you're listening to Education Insight. Our guest is Jon Blanton Fullerton, a researcher from the USC EdPolicy Hub. Dr. Fullerton, you mentioned parents, and I want to stick here for a second. In your view, how can communities, and by that I mean especially parents, students, and educators, how can we be mobilized to focus on evidence-based solutions rather than the divisive rhetoric that you mentioned and that we've all seen so much of over the last couple of years? What role does community engagement play in creating sustainable educational change?
So I think community engagement is quite essential for this. And part of it is really focusing the communities and parents, students, and educators in particular on things that we already agree on. And that sort of like really try to sort of work on, as opposed to sort of focusing on all the things that we disagree on, sort of work on what we do agree on. And you might say, oh, well, we don't agree on anything these days, but we do. And some of my colleagues at the Hub have done some survey research, and there's a heartening amount of agreement. between Democrats and Republicans on sort of kind of the core functions and what schools are supposed to do, teaching reading and writing and math and science, and also in terms of preparing kids for a successful career going forward. And so there are a bunch of areas where I think we have agreement that's implicit already that would be good to focus on and move forward with. So that's kind of one big chunk. I think the second is really, and this would be encouraging parents and community organizations to really also look at the data and sort of see where is the local school district struggling, then focusing on evidence-based solutions to that. And so we at the Hub, sort of one of the things we're doing now actually is working with we're gathering a number of districts into a network to use their own data to focus on college and career access for their kids.
To bolster your argument, here in the Inland Empire, we have had a great degree of success with schools that have converted to the community schools model, where businesses and parents and people who are not parents but just live in the region of a particular school, they come together and they make the choices for that school as a community instead of a board meeting in a boardroom with just parents in the room. It's a great success.
Right.
So do you believe that California should create educational spaces, actual places and opportunities where families of all political and moral beliefs feel included and respected and can generate that kind of dialogue?
Yes, although I think that's really, I'm not sure how California does that, sort of except through things like helping to fund community schools, which they do. But I think that's really a local issue, sort of like making sure that sort of the parents in the community are involved and that they have spaces to talk. So there are things that California can do to encourage it, but really it's something that's done, has to be done kind of by its nature locally.
In the community, just the community.
In the community, yes, yeah.
Gotcha.
In the community and with the district.
The article emphasizes the importance of local education improvements, that we really need to address this. What unique opportunities are you seeing for California to innovate at the local level, particularly in areas like early childhood education or building stronger connections between schools and the workforce?
Right. Well, I think you just talked about sort of one, which is sort of using community schools and sort of developing pathways programs to connect in the workforce and connect to colleges. So that I think is something, and again, that has to be done on a somewhat local basis. California has just recently implemented, as you know, a universal transitional kindergarten, which gives more opportunity there. But again, locals can, LEAs, local education agencies, can think of themselves as empowered to do what's needed and to sort of do all of the things that we talked about if they want to.
So let me ask you this. What does California need to do if we intend to lead the nation in education reform and set an example for other states?
What we began with, which was really focusing on kind of curriculum and instructional excellence, and doing this through a number of approaches. So both sort of making sure that the right curriculum are getting to teachers and schools, but also providing the support and the development for teachers and for district leaders to ensure that it's implemented effectively.
If you could recommend one bold, immediate change to California's education system, what would your choice be, and why is that?
Having good standards and sort of curriculum options, but sort of really focusing on making sure that sort of every student gets exposed to and sort of excellent teaching in an effective curriculum would be probably the most impactful.
Jon Blanton Fullerton. He's a research professor and the executive director of the USC EdPolicy Hub. He's also one of the authors of an article featured this week in EdSource. It's called Playing the Long Game in an Uncertain Education Policy Climate. He is talking about real solutions that we need to come to for education in California. And we appreciate you joining us on Education Insight today, Jon, and helping us understand this.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk.
Next week, some really good news in education. High school and middle school athletes are doing far better academically than they have in decades past. Research shows pretty clearly that it's due to big changes in how schools, coaches, parents, and teachers view support for our athletes, college readiness, and building the whole athlete. On the next Education Insight, we're joined by the Commissioner of Athletics for the California Interscholastic Federation, Mike West. I hope you'll join us. Until then, I'm Lacey Kendall. Have a great week.
Hi, this is Jacob Poor, Executive Producer of Education Insight. Thank you for listening to the program. Do you have any suggestions for stories we should be covering? Are you aware of problems in local education that we should be looking at, or amazing students or educators we should be honoring? Write to us at info@inlandempiregia.org. That's info@inlandempiregia.org. Thank you for your suggestions so far. We appreciate your insight.
Education Insight is produced in partnership with KVCR San Bernardino.
Our executive producer is Jacob Poor.
And our production engineer is Tyler Veazey.
Lacey Kendall is your host. Support is provided by College Futures Foundation.
Some technical assistance provided by the College of Arts and Letters at Cal State San Bernardino.
Growing Inland Achievement. Working together for inland education and economic success.
Join us again next week for Education Insight.